My name is George M. Johnson. I am a journalist, an activist, and a philanthropist. I'm going to talk a little bit about me and my story as a member of a Black Greek letter organization and a person who also identifies as being queer. So it's interesting because this project was actually suggested to me by one of my really good friends who's an older brother within my chapter who at convention this year was like, when are you gonna tell your story? He like, cause you know, we all fucks with you now. So but he was like, it took a lot of years for you to build this. And he was like, I think the world needs to see what it looks like when you build and when you know, that you fought so hard to show the intersect and how we could all get along and how, you know, that we could learn to appreciate LGBTQ people because of your voice and because of the work you're doing, because we get to, you know, be your biggest cheerleaders now when we were at one point your biggest adversaries. I joined the organization back in 2006, and since that time I've had my struggles being who I am and also being a member of the organization and dealing with the images and of projecting masculinity. A little bit about the orgs. We are considered the Divine Nine, which is 9 Black Greek letter organizations, started in 1906 with Alpha Phi Alpha being the first. We've been at the forefront of many of the movements, the women's rights movement back in the 20s, the civil rights movement of the 60s, and we've always found a way to be involved in anything that's going on within the Black community to help our communities as best we can. As we have started to progress into a movement where it is being led by people of color and Black people who identify as queer, we're now starting to notice a shift in the narrative and a shift in the way that activism is happening and a shift in the way that our culture is responding to issues around Blackness with the intersection of queerness. And so I felt it was important now that we have a serious conversation around the issues around homophobia, the LGBTQ, and Black Greek life. I joined Alpha Phi Alpha Fraternity Incorporated back in the spring of 2006. Initiated March 25th, even though we typically in Greek communities go by our probate date, which would be April 7th. It was our 100th year as an organization, so it was a big deal. I was the number 7 on our line, which would be considered the jewel, so my spot was kind of like the revered spot within our organization. Things weren't always easy. Even though I wasn't out at that time, people still knew because I'm me and I've always been me. As a person who's always been effeminate and effeminate for pretty much my whole life, as my family would say, it wasn't like I could hide it. I actually think that part of me joining the organization was to try and toughen myself up in some way or try and work on my image around masculinity. It didn't work, but I did learn that there was a way, you know, years later, that I could intersect the two and make it all work for me. As I went through the org, I kind of rose up within a chapter level kind of fast. So I became the chapter president, which some older brothers were like, gay kid is the chapter president, like, I don't know about this. And so I had to deal with a lot of criticism and pushback from that. From there, I brought through Align, so I'm the dean of Align in 2007, and so then more criticism came like, y'all gonna keep letting this, you know, this faggot keep, you know, doing these things. Fall of 2007 that I was allowed to be the dean of Align. And so then, you know, more comments came like, y'all gonna continue to let this faggot, you know, have these high positions within our fraternity? I don't know about this. And, you know, I would hear the whispers. It was never a direct issue, but it was always behind the scenes where people were talking about me, talking about it, and it would just come back to me. And it was hard though, as a 21, 22-year-old who hadn't come out yet, who hadn't fully identified as who I was dealing with an identity crisis with myself and also fighting to prove that I belonged within my organization. As the years continued to go on, things didn't get much better. By 08, 09, I was starting to be more out, and it was becoming a bigger problem for many of the brothers. And it became a point of contention. We didn't get along. We butted heads. We went back and forth on many issues. And unfortunately, it led to me pulling myself away. So by 2008, 2009, I was beginning to identify more with my, sexual identity. So when that came about, I was going to clubs more, people were seeing me out more, and it was becoming a bigger issue within the fraternity, only because I was helping the younger brothers so much, and I had such a close relationship with the younger brothers. Some of the older brothers didn't understand, and so there was a huge disconnect in, like, why is his respect level so high when y'all know we not kind of for this. By 2010 was kind of when all hell broke loose. I had had enough, they had had enough, and we had gotten to a pretty big argument, me and some older brothers. And my final breaking point was when I reached out to a brother who was, in the black church, just kind of with my concerns, because he knew of me and some of the other brothers I was having issues with, and his response was less than favorable. It was more like, well, because of your identity, I can accept you into Christ, but I'm not sure if I can accept you as a brother, or as like you still have this issue. And that's when I made the decision that I was not gonna live in pieces, like for the appeasement of other people. I kind of went harder. I started really talking more about the issues that I was having. I started intersecting myself within my chapter more and talking to the brothers about some of the things that I was going through and some of the issues I had. I was blessed to have a line where there were several of us who identified as gay, and then several of us who identified as heterosexual. And so people were able to see how easy and how free-flowing our relationships were and how we used to travel together. And I think it brought about an understanding from other brothers to be like, well, if they all could get along, what are we missing? Like, what's happening here? By 2011, I started running Homecoming for us, and I was stepmaster. That year, we won the step show, our homecoming tailgate was popping, and everybody was like, okay, maybe George is all right. Like, maybe George is okay. As the years progressed and people started to see my work in activism, my work in journalism, my fight for LGBTQ people, more heterosexual people who I was friends with, more heterosexual brothers started to come around to the idea of, okay, there are identities outside of us, maybe we just need to listen. Like, maybe it's not so much about this masculinity thing as much as it's about the protection of Black people. And so that's kind of why this story now is so important, me telling my story as a way to bring about the necessary conversations that we need within not just Black Greek life, but Black institutions and Black organizations, i.e. the NAACP, i.e. the Black church, i.e. historically Black colleges and universities. Like, there's such a bigger picture that needs to be discussed, not just on a micro level, but on a macro level of how Black institutions oftentimes oppress others within with like a talented 10th mentality. And it's just time for us to progress past that. LGBTQ identities are going to continue to increase, so why not be more inclusive of them within our movement spaces? Why not hear their stories? As we continue to progress as, Black Greek letter organizations, and more people continue to identify, we can't continue to reject members based on sexuality. We just have to grow from there, and we have to find some type of, not even a common ground, because again, we all Black, we all in this fight together. And so anytime you try and put yourself in a place of privilege as, well, I'm a Black Greek, well, I'm Black middle class, which isn't a thing, but I'm Black middle class, all you're really doing is watching other people drown until you're eventually thrown off the boat by white supremacy. So this whole thing is to bring about the needed conversations we need to have around people who identify as LGBTQ or identify as something other than the heteronormative society that we've always lived in, because it's time for us to be one and be a fist in the fight against white supremacy. And we can't do that if we're still so hung up on patriarchal traditions that, you know, we never, in respectability politics as Negroes, when there's no such thing as being a respectable Negro. One of the most important things in bringing this short docuseries to life is the importance of understanding that LGBTQ issues are Black Greek letter organizational issues. The best analogy I could do for people to understand is the HIV epidemic. HIV is a huge issue within the MSM, men who have sex with men, community. So when you look at your organizations and you look at the percentage of members who may identify as either gay or bisexual, even though there is no real analysis done, as a person who's been in the room, you know, there are a lot of gay individuals, there are a lot of bisexual individuals who are a part of our organizations. So even if at a minimum, a quarter of your organization or 30% of your organization happens to identify as gay and bisexual, if you look at the CDC numbers, the CDC is saying that 50% of Black MSMs will contract HIV over their lifetime. So if you take the 25% or the 30% of your org that identifies within that spectrum, you have a potential to have upwards of 12.5% to 15% or even higher of your members who may contract HIV or who may already have HIV within these orgs. So the biggest issue is when we look at, we just, you know, masculinity and, you know, the imagery of our orgs, we do a disservice to some of the other social detriments that go on within the community, because that erasure of a person's identity also erases the oppressions that they face that a heterosexual person may not face. You know, another big issue is when we look at the protections needed for transgender women. If we continue to have this argument within orgs of, well, we don't want trans people here, or we don't want these people to identify as us, they're going to continue to be murdered at a high rate, at a much higher rate. You know, the average life expectancy of a Black trans woman is only 35 years of age. We have to do a better job of not being so pro-Black with conditions. We have to do a better job as Black Greek letter organizations of understanding that, you know, we didn't have, you know, in the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, that many people who identified within that spectrum. Well, now we do, and now because we do, we have to make their issues our issues, because their issues are our issues. And the longer we go and the longer we keep giving pushback on this idea of holding up masculinity, or this idea of what womanhood, you know, has to look like within the sororities, our people are going to continue to die, and we're continuing to oppress our own, like being the oppressed who oppress. That can never work, and it's not going to work. As we have seen, the movement has become one led by queer people. You know, Black Lives Matter was started by queer women. That's a big deal. I work all the time with Black Youth Project and people who are members of BYP who are in Greek letter orgs, and we have such a good time talking about, you know, our fraternities and our sororities, but we also have to talk about the unfortunate thing is that many of us have had to leave our organizations to do this work and to do movement work, because our orgs are so caught up in, you know, the status quo and not wanting to you know, like K. Michelle said, shake the table, you know, or some of these issues. And so, again, it's like we have to do better with having an appreciation for our brothers and our sisters who are LGBTQ, especially those who are within the organizations who are doing powerful work in movement spaces and can't intersect that work with the thousands of members who could potentially be backing us and helping us shift the narrative and shift policy and make these changes. We can't do it by ourselves outside of these orgs, and so at some point we have to do a better job of intersecting these orgs into the LGBT, not just an LGBT movement, but the movement is inclusive of LGBT people. And that's where we need to go. We're gonna do more work within this docuseries we're gonna get some voices from some heterosexual members of my chapter to talk about how they felt about me years ago and how they feel about me now, and just some of how their minds have changed around homophobia and masculinity and how I've helped them to get there. Because I think it's important that other members of other orgs see them and see them talk about it as a way as like a conduit into the heterosexual community. We're gonna bring in some of the other organizations to talk and have a full dialogue back and forth about some of the things we've struggled with, some of the good things that have happened, some of the bad things that have happened. We just don't want the conversation to stop, but we do want the conversation to create change. And so that's what this whole project is about. It's not about bashing heterosexuals. It's not about the gay agenda or, that people often try to say we're on. It's about stopping the conditional pro-blackness that goes on within our community. It's about, unifying us and understanding that queer people have a space within this movement. We're not looking for diversity and inclusion in shit that we already in. I don't need to be included in something I'm already in, but I do need to be acknowledged. And we do need to be acknowledged. And so that's what this is about, is to start that acknowledgement and start to bridge that gap that really has been severely strained, especially since the movement spaces have become more queer and the old guard and the old institutions of Black movement spaces have started to become so silent. And so that's what we're doing. It's time for us all to raise our voices. Again, I'm George Johnson, journalist, activist, philanthropist, and join us for the ride.